Anti-apartheid activist Regina Brooks, who defied the Immorality Act, sadly passed away recently. Under the Act, white people in South Africa were prohibited from having relationships with black people. Brooks was one of those white people who fought against the Act and then went on to live in Soweto after being disowned by her family for refusing to give up her love child, Thandi. We are reflecting on her life and times with Demi Timms, her granddaughter. Demi, good morning to you. Accept our condolences on the passing of your grandmother. And I think it's a history that oftentimes gets lost with the histories of so many other people and so many other events. But it was a landmark move, a historic and brave move that she made at the time to reclaim her own identity, to live with her child and with her partner. And I'd love for you to take us back to her story at that time in South Africa, where relationships, especially marriage and sexual relationships across the colour lines, was legislated against.
Good morning, Iman, to you and your listeners, and thank you so much for having us. To try and sum up that story in a few minutes is almost impossible, but I'll try my best. So my granny was a white woman who was born and raised in the Free State in a small town called Memel on Rooiport Farm, and she was the 10th of 12 kids. She learned to speak isiZulu, she learned to speak Sesotho on the farm from the farm workers and the farm workers' friends. And in one of the interviews she did sometime in 2001, she said she's always identified with black people. She never looked at herself and saw herself as a white woman. She then fell pregnant and, as you mentioned, was disowned by her family and moved to Dube, where she stayed with a black man, and that was against the Immorality Act. But her fight didn't stop there. She continued and she fought the system, she fought the act, she defied the act, and she then appealed to be reclassified as non-white so that she could stay with her daughter, who would then be classified as a colored child. And she was sentenced to 4 months imprisonment. She got bail. And in 1957, she won the appeal, and she was reclassified as non-white and then allowed to stay with her child and stay with her partner at the time. She moved on to go to Soweto, where she lived for a while, was forcefully removed from there. She then ended up in what we know now as Western, and then later moved to Nuclear, where she lived up until 1974. And in 1974, she moved to Eldorado Park, where she continued to grow this family tree of hers. I think the beauty in my granny's story is that she came to Johannesburg by herself. No loved ones, no family. And today she leaves behind 6 children. She leaves behind 25 grandchildren. She leaves 37 great-grands and 5 great-great-grandchildren. Yeah. So she indeed leaves a legacy behind.
An incredibly proud history, Demi, which I'm so impressed you understand, you connect, and you're able to share with people who don't have the benefit of their history at their fingertips. And we forget that the stories of the breakdown of the apartheid system was through the connective tissue, the action of individuals in their homes, in their families, resisting and saying no. So thank you for beautifully encapsulating that. I want to go back to court, because what's so interesting for me about your great-grandmother's story is how there were themes of acceptance and rejection throughout her life, through the decisions that she made. Even in going to live in a coloured or so-called coloured community, there was rejection and acceptance. So there was always that sort of twin theme that she experienced throughout the course of her life. Even in court, refusing to testify in Afrikaans, which she spoke, because she also, in a sense, it was, her resistance, but also her wanting to reinforce the idea of her new identity that she was trying to take on. And I'd love for you to just traverse that piece of her story with us.
Yeah, so when she was at the time of appeal, when she was going for a court appearance, she refused to speak English or Afrikaans, although she could speak the language and she understood what they were asking. She did ask that they translate everything they were saying to isiZulu. And every single question that was asked, every single question that was posed, she responded to in isiZulu. And that was in her words, that was to prove her blackness. She also wore her baby on her back, so she wore Thandi on her back, and she wore a doek to try and strengthen this argument. Her attorney at the time also when appealing to the court, mentioned that she had gone native and could no longer be seen as a white woman. So that was how that went for.
And then later on in life, you know, her identity and the awareness of the system at the time, and in her way, how she proclaimed and exercised her resistance. Just talk to us about that piece of her journey as well.
I think later in my granny's life, you know, and I had this conversation with my dad yesterday, that her fight was never a political fight. She fought against injustice. And when one spoke to her about her fights and pushing back and her identity, etc., there was always this deep disappointment and deep bitterness towards the new dispensation as it is, because obviously all her kids now and all her grandkids would be classified as colored. And she always saw that as a disadvantage to them, that she was fighting an injustice, but to an extent she felt like her kids and her grandkids were now under the new dispensation being disadvantaged. So, you know, that disappointment was tangible. And if I can take it a step further, she'd often share stories and tell us about how government officials would pitch up at her home, for example, and promise to give her flowers, promise to name a street after, promise to name a community wall after, because of the impact that she had. And that was all talk with no action. To date, that's still the case. Somebody put it so beautifully at a memorial, Iman, where they said that, you know, they promised to give her flowers, and in the words of Brenda Fassie, today it's too late for Mama, that can't happen anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard thing to reconcile, and I can, you know, I can just relate to what the children are thinking and feeling, what you as grandchildren are thinking and feeling. It's this kind of invisibility that exists, you know, with certain activists and people who kind of brought the idea and the challenge to the apartheid system to the fore, who kind of get lost in that maelstrom where, you know, in a context where others kind of get the limelight, whether that's, you know, deliberate or accidental. That happens. And it is in the telling of these stories that we understand the complexity and the tapestry of resistance that it took to bring down the system. Ultimately, as you say, her fight wasn't really political. Although some would say, you know, fighting for a relationship becomes political in a system that denies you the right to do that. Yeah. And just to go back again then into what it means in that resistance, before I come to the fact that there is a call that she be memorialized, you know, for her efforts in a way. But the cost of what that does, I don't know what your mom and your, you know, other members of the family recall from the time that, you know, that she was resistant to the system, going to court and having to claim and reclaim her identity. Some of the other stories about the high price that came with.
Well, we've been trying to baffle, we've been trying to read some articles to get some information, because my cousin always puts it so beautifully. She says, Ma has amnesia, because often when you'd ask about some of these things, I don't know if she deliberately chose not to share certain battles that she faced, or if it is that she just honestly didn't remember. But when you read some of the articles in some of the reports that she's provided, it just speaks to, and I can imagine for anybody, that anybody would face some sort of like emotional scarring, emotional turmoil, when pushing back like that and when going through that sort of resistance. One of the powerful statements that I read that she made is that time she was fighting to be Black. And throughout her life thereafter, she always felt like she was then too white to be Black. She always made that statement, and that stuck with her so profoundly, maybe because she felt that fight was in vain to an extent, if that makes sense.
No, totally understand that. And it's interesting because the identity conversation, the identity conundrum, the identity conflict in South Africa is still so stark, so many years into our democracy. And would be interesting to see how the family and you, especially as young people and this generation and the next, view your identity through the lens of your grandmother's struggle.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, specifically in the New South Africa. We are all classified now as colored kids, and you always feel like you're caught somewhere in between. that you, in certain instances, like I mentioned before, you're not quite black enough. In other instances, you're not quite white enough. And again, this boils down to that element of the colored child not always having opportunity, not always having job opportunities. So I do think it is something that, as so-called colored people, that we struggle with, that we battle with.
Yeah, perhaps we all need to, in this moment, go back, and it might be instructive to read Biko again, whose life we memorialized the other day, Demi. This location and dislocation of race and identity is still such a painful but incredibly important topic in South Africa. As a final word, I'd love to give you the opportunity to share with those who want to share in her celebration ceremony the details of when that is happening. I understand that's all unfolding tomorrow.
Yes, that is tomorrow. We will be laying her to rest tomorrow from the St. Andrew's Methodist Church in Eldorado Park, Extension 2. That ceremony starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And from the church, we will then be going to Calgrove Memorial Park in Nasrec, where her body will be laid to rest finally. Thank you.
All right. And again, condolences to the family and strength as you say goodbye to a formidable woman, Regina Brooks, whose life we're reflecting upon with her granddaughter, Demi Timms. Thank you so much.